Okay, so we'll get started now. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everybody, and welcome to the final installment of our Fall 2022 Global Economic Governance Book Talk series hosted by Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Rishikesh Rambandari, Assistant Director of the Global Economic Governance here at the GDP Center. So Nigeria has long been regarded as the poster child for the curse of oil wealth. Yet, despite this, Nigeria has achieved strong economic growth for over a decade in the 21st century, driven largely by policy reforms in non-oil sectors. In economic diversification in Nigeria, the politics of building a post-oil economy, Zainab Usman argues that Nigeria's major development challenge is not the oil curse, but rather one of achieving economic diversification beyond oil, subsistence agriculture, informal activities, and across its subnational entities. Through analysis drawing on economic data, policy documents, and interviews, Usman poses that Nigeria's challenge of economic diversification is situated within the political setting of an unstable distribution of power among individual, group, and institutional actors. To diversify Nigeria's economy, this book argues that successive governments must reorient towards a consistent focus on pro-productivity and pro-poor policies alongside comprehensive civil service and security sector overhaul. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Zainab Usman, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Her fields of expertise include institutions, economic policy, energy policy, and emerging economies in Africa. Previously, she was public sector specialist at the World Bank, where she worked on social sustainability, policy reforms, natural resources management, and disruptive technologies. She has worked on these issues in Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, Nigeria, Papua New Guinea, the Republic of Congo, Serbia, Tanzania, and Uzbekistan. So now in terms of a few logistics, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible. During the Q&A, please use the Q&A box in your Zoom menu to ask questions. Please also give your name and affiliation. We will take questions after our initial discussion, but please feel free to enter your questions at any time. So first, we will have Zainab do a brief introduction, and then we will move into an informal conversation on our book before opening up for Q&A. So take it away, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Rishi. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Really a pleasure to join you today to talk about my book, which was published this summer. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Maybe I'm going to start with a brief, I don't want to call it an overview. It's not an overview, it's not a summary, maybe just some highlights of key points in the book that can then prompt a broader discussion, and that I hope will encourage you to get a copy to read, whether it's to agree with me or to disagree with me or just to learn new information. So just give me a second. Okay. So let me try to do this in the next maybe 5 to 7 minutes to highlight a couple of key points, key arguments, key findings of the book. As you know, this is a book on Nigeria, but it's really an academic book in the sense that I started the research while I was doing my doctorate at the University of Oxford. I finished grad school, joined the World Bank, and I continued working on that research area, which then produced the book and a couple of papers and other outputs. But overall, I think the insights from the book could help provide a better understanding of how we think about the development challenges of low and middle income countries that are rich in hydrocarbons in Africa, but also in other parts of the world. So the 5 key points that I want to highlight are the following. The first is that I argue in the book that we need an alternative framework for thinking through the challenges of oil-rich countries in particular. As we know, that there are prevailing theories and explanations on the challenges that these countries face. The challenges, if we were to summarize them, include sustaining growth, not just experiencing growth, not just having a growth spurt, but being able to sustain that over a long period of time, industrializing and diversifying the economy, sharing the proceeds of that growth, achieving human development, and broadening prosperity. Those are some of the challenges that these countries face. And the prevailing explanations so far attribute these challenges to some inherent characteristic in the country. And there are 2 of such explanations that I focus on in the book and that I critically interrogate and that I disagree with in a sense. So the first prevailing theory or explanation is that these countries, particularly oil-rich countries, are afflicted by an oil curse. And then the second one is that it is actually a neo-patrimonial culture or institutional setting that obstructs economic and social development in these countries. So my book, therefore, and the other papers and the work that I've done over the past decade or so aims to present an alternative way of thinking through the challenges of these countries. And I identify the challenge that they face as primarily one of diversifying their economies. So this is an argument I'm putting forward, but it's also not an argument that I am making alone. There is an emerging body of work on this front that is really going beyond an oil curse or a resource curse or a neo-patrimonial culture. So that is really point number 1 that I want to highlight. Point number 2 is then to try to explain what this alternative framework is. And my explanation is that Nigeria's economy, this is the country that I focus on, but as I mentioned, I think there are a lot of broad implications for Africa, for other low and middle income countries around the world. So Nigeria's economy is still dependent on oil exports and has not achieved sustained structural transformation due to this intersection of politics and policymaking. Specifically, it is due to an unstable political settlement or an unstable distribution of political power that Nigeria's policymakers find themselves in a perpetual state of crisis management. Due to this distribution of power, meaning that policymakers are constantly managing crisis, their policy orientation is towards macroeconomic stabilization, the restoration of growth, selective public sector reforms, or what I call in the book easy fix reforms, not because they're easy, but because they're easier to do than stuff like land reform, petroleum sector deregulation, civil service reforms, and others, things that can actually help increase productivity in an economy. So this policy orientation that we see among Nigerian policymakers is hardly ever the systematic long-term orientation needed to drive structural transformation and, of course, then to diversify the economy. And this dynamic that I just explained has occurred throughout Nigeria's history from the 1960s when the country attained independence, and it is really regime agnostic. Whether during military rule, the country experienced about 3 decades of military rule, or during democratic administration. So for the past 22 years or so, Nigeria has been an electoral democracy. So this dynamic is really regime agnostic. The third point that I want to highlight is that then to really zoom in on this notion of crisis management and what it entails, what it really means. So in this crisis management policy orientation, policy reforms actually happen. So it's not that reforms do not happen. It's not that meaningful policies are not implemented. They are, but they are focused on short-term economic stabilization rather than the long-term focus on structural transformation and then, of course, economic diversification. So let me explain that a bit. During periods of relative political stability in the political settlement, and we can talk about the political settlement in a bit more detail during the discussion, what I find in the book, and I talk about extensively, is that we see that meaningful policy reforms and national projects are implemented, and then the economy grows rapidly. So the country experiences a growth episode during this reform era. And there have been several reform eras historically in Nigeria. So I'll give you an example. Nigeria, like quite a number of African countries, experienced a lost decade of growth in the 80s and the 1990s in particular. But then in the 2000s, we saw that growth started to rebound from around 2003 or so. When the balance of power shifted, the country transitioned to democratic rule. But then this growth episode, which lasted for initially about a decade or so, then started to falter as the political settlement became highly unstable from around 2010. And again, we can talk about the details of what happened at that time. So within this decade of the growth era and the reform era, growth averaged between 2003 and 2011 initially, around 7% per annum on average, driven largely by non-oil sectors where reforms did happen. So banking and finance, information and communications technology, there was a big push for liberalization of ICT at the time, entertainment, trade, and other industries where these easy fix reforms were implemented. And due to this decade-long non-oil growth since 2003, so 2003 to 2011, then growth started to slow down 2011 to 2015, and then the country went into a recession in 2016. It actually experienced 2 recessions between 2016 and 2022. So within that initial decade of non-oil growth, we saw that the share of the oil sector's share of GDP actually declined from around close to half of GDP to less than 10% today. However, the oil sector still accounts for more than 80% of export earnings and more than 50% of government revenues, which is where the real problem lies. So this is just an example of one growth spurt during a reform era. And what I talk about extensively in the book is that over the course of Nigeria's history, we've seen about 3 or so such growth episodes preceded by reform eras. And then the 4th point I want to make, and then kind of zooming out a bit to talk more about kind of theory and a framing here, is that clearly Nigeria is not one of 2 binaries. It is neither a failed state, neither is it a developmental state. This is clearly a country that can experience growth episodes. The growth episodes, however, never seem to last beyond a decade at most, right? Which is the problem. And this is the argument that I'm making, that the reform era, when it happens, is focused on crisis management, addressing that crisis, but not on setting the country on course for structural economic transformation. So it is not a country that is doomed to perpetual economic stagnation. It can break out of economic stagnation, and we've seen that happen. But it is also not a developmental state. The literature on developmental states focused on East Asia that were able to sustain economic growth for 2-3 decades, achieving growth rates of 10, 15, in some cases even up close to 20% per annum. The East Asian tigers, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and of course, more recently, the big elephant in the room, which is China. Rather, Nigeria is what I would describe as an intermediate state. Now, using the term intermediate state is actually not even my own, it's not a term I coined. It's a term I would say, repurposing from Peter Evans. So Peter Evans in the 1990s, had this typology of states, developmental states, East Asia, etc. Intermediate states, he classified Brazil, India, and a couple of other countries there, and then neo-patrimonial states, which are basically close to state failure, and he put Nigeria there. So I am actually repurposing that classification and putting Nigeria as an intermediate state, which clearly can produce growth spurts, can implement reforms and meaningful policies and national projects, but in its present configuration is really incapable of policy reforms that transform and diversify the economy. And the reason for this, the explanatory variable, I would say, is the unstable political settlement. Ruling elites are constrained to lean towards destabilization policies. They can do the easy fix reforms such as ICT and financial liberalization. They've done extensive public financial management reforms, transparency reforms, set up a sovereign wealth fund. They have actually fairly effective counter-cyclical fiscal policies, but the country is really not on course for structural transformation. And of course, we know that Nigeria, and I talk about this extensively in the book, has struggled with, the kinds of initiatives that can help facilitate increased productivity and, of course, structural transformation. So the provision of transport and electricity infrastructure, implementing agriculture and land reform, extensive petroleum sector deregulation. These are all things that the country has struggled with. And then the final point to kind of conclude this these initial remarks is that, in the book itself, I conclude with 5 points and 5 recommendations. But I want to highlight just one here, which is perhaps more relevant for this discussion today. That overall, my work, and of course, the work that other people are doing on this front, whether it's Mushtaq Khan, whether it's John Philip Steins and others, is that we really need a more accurate diagnosis of the development challenges that resource-rich countries face. Clearly, something like the oil curse or neo-patrimonial culture is just insufficient. They provide interesting and very partial explanations of the challenges that these countries face. But more importantly, they've had a very disproportionate impact and influence on policy solutions that these countries are meant to have implemented for the past 2 or 3 decades. And clearly those policy solutions have not worked. So we need to really rethink how we diagnose the challenges of these countries and what kinds of policy solutions we put forward. I'm going to stop there. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Thank you for that overview. I'll start exactly where where you stopped, which is sort of on the resource curse sort of issue, right? And so, you alluded to how policy solutions resting on that concept perhaps may not make sense in every setting. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Why do you think resource curse as a lens is not really sort of satisfactory in Nigeria's case?
Sure. So I like the way you posed that question. The resource curse in particular, that theory, it's not even a theory, like it's a whole body of work that really attributes the complex range of challenges that these countries face to the resource, the commodity itself. That is the explanatory variable. This has, to a large extent, been the prevailing thinking in conceptualizing the challenges that these countries face and the policy solutions that are put forward. I think it has that framework of thinking has given us very interesting and some useful insights, I would say. But these are partial, these are insufficient, these are incomplete. So let me start with what the resource curse has gotten right. Starting with because again, it has various elements, and the idea is that this commodity causes economic, political, and social challenges. So let me start with the economic part, particularly the Dutch disease element. Just to summarize very, very quickly, Dutch disease here referring to the macroeconomic challenges that a country that depends on a major commodity for its revenue streams experiences. So exchange rate volatility, revenue volatility, and then the uncompetitiveness of tradable sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, in favor of non-tradable sectors, services, especially those that are auxiliary to the commodity sector. So whether it's banking and finance, for example, and things like that. And of course, there are a lot of useful insights from the Dutch disease that, of course, when you have an influx of revenues from one source, revenues that are external in nature, that are subject to the vagaries of the international oil market, there are certain pathologies that will develop. So that is a very useful insight, actually, and those counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies that have resulted from thinking through the Dutch disease, I think have been very, very useful. The problem is that is not the sum total of the challenges that these countries face, because if, as a country, either as a policymaker or just, more broadly, your thinking is only focused on managing revenues and you're not thinking through ways to facilitate structural economic transformation, then you're going to be stuck. And unfortunately, this is what has been the case in many countries, and even in the case of Nigeria, where there has been such a predominant focus on revenue management. We here thinking about even scholars, we have just not been thinking through things like industrial policies, the provision of physical and human capital, and other such things that are needed to drive productivity in other sectors of the economy, right? So that is really the first thing, that the Dutch disease element, I think, has been very, very useful. I am not going to deny that. Now, coming to the other aspects where I think the resource curse thinking falls short, has been incomplete, and in some cases has actually been quite flawed, is really the variable, the explanatory variable, and the direction of causality, the idea that it is that commodity that causes everything else. So as scholars, as policymakers, our thinking should be entirely focused on managing, on limiting the damage that commodity causes, right? That has really been the focus of policy for the past 2 or 3 decades. So you're trying to ensure that production of that resource is not happening in ways that can interfere with the rest of the economy. You're trying to limit the damage that can be caused by resource revenues, either by setting up a sovereign wealth fund or by, creating buffers. Those are not bad things, but they're just not enough to kickstart structural transformation to increase productivity in an economy, because you are just entirely ascribing the entirety of the problem to that commodity itself. And then maybe the final thing I'll mention with respect to why this has just not been, why explanations, why solutions provided by the resource curse thinking have just been insufficient, is they completely ignore the structural characteristics of the domestic and global economy that create challenges and opportunities for resource-rich countries. So to go into a bit of that, first of all, you look at the domestic economy or the domestic situation of a country, its history, its social composition, the strength of its institutions, its private sector development, whether the country has a robust private sector, whether or not, whether the country, the rest of the country's endowment structure, whether it has a large population, whether it has a large labor supply or small labor supply. And here I want to contrast Nigeria with Guyana, for example. Guyana is now a major oil producer. If you do the calculation on a per capita basis, by 2025 or so, when the oil projects under development in Guyana come on stream, it's going to become one of the world's largest oil producers per capita. I think it's going to be the largest per capita, but it's a very small economy with with less than 1 million people, small labor supply. If Guyana wants to do things like local content, they're going to look very different from a country like Nigeria or even from Saudi Arabia, with 60 million people, 200 million people. So, there are all these other dynamics that within the domestic economy that would lead to variable outcomes. And we've seen that. The dysfunctions in Nigeria are not the same with the dysfunctions in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has higher human capital development, as do the rest of the GCC economies. Nigeria, Gabon have lower human capital development. Nigeria has a larger private sector compared to Gabon, and therefore, even though Nigeria is a major oil producing country, it's also not only Africa's largest economy, but it has some of Africa's most dynamic non-oil firms, whether in banking or finance or manufacturing. Then there are also transnational dynamics here. We're looking at global commodity markets, where demand comes from, whether a country is a price taker or price maker like Saudi Arabia and the United States, and even Russia to an extent, which by virtue of their oil production can influence global oil prices. So if they're experiencing revenue volatility, they can ramp up or reduce production to actually change the dynamics of their own domestic economies, right? So all this to say, and I went into the weeds a bit here, is that there are all these structural characteristics that if you just focus on the commodity itself, you ignore, and then you're unable to explain variation that we see even among different oil-rich countries. So I'm going to stop there. And maybe the final thing to mention is that as a result of these, I think I sometimes I use the word flaw, but I'm also a bit mindful because there are aspects of the resource curse that are useful. They have given us insight. So as a result of this incompleteness, I would say, of the resource curse way of or approach or theory of thinking, the solutions themselves have not been very, very effective, as I mentioned earlier. I'm going to stop there on that.
Great. No, thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about the pace of change and I think the sort of the episodic nature of sort of policy change in Nigeria, and that theme comes across very strongly in your book. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Particularly in relation to what you were mentioning earlier about crises, right, and how certain reforms are put in place during crises, but others are not. So could you sort of elaborate on this a little bit more?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Oh, sorry. Just sort of the pace of change, and how there is sort of this episodic trend, if you look at Nigeria's history, where you sort of see concentration of changes happening in sort of certain parts of history. And so could you sort of, unpack this a little bit in terms of how you make sense of it using sort of your framework?
Yeah, good question. So the book itself and my work is really around political economy. I think there are a few of us that increasingly are calling ourselves political economists, because we see that you really cannot separate the two. And more now, that is becoming very, very evident. And we can talk about that a bit later. And for my work, the key variable is politics. It's not the commodity, it's politics. And politics here is not just generic politics or elections or, it's something a bit more precise, which is that it is political power, its distribution, the actors, the groups, and the institutions where political power lie, that configuration, and then how that configuration changes over time. All of those shape policy choices. That really is a sum of, or is a summary of the framework that I use. But to go into a bit more detail, so I use a political settlements framework. It's not quite a theory, it's a framework or an approach that people are kind of using in different ways to be able to capture these things that I mentioned, political power itself, where it lies, how it's distributed, how that distribution changed, the impacts, the intersection with policy making, and then of course the economic outcomes. And in the framework that I use, there are 4 key dimensions that I look at. Elite bargains, so the consensus among the most powerful people in society, and every society has an elite bargain, by the way. Whether it's the US, whether it's the UK, there's some underlying elite bargain. It might look different, but depending on the country, it might be formal, highly formalized. It might be a bit more informal, but an elite bargain is the first dimension. Then the relationship between elites and non-elites, whether social movements, social groups, trade unions, etc., is a second dimension. The third dimension is the broad economic agenda of a country. Again, this could be highly formalized. You can see that in policy documents. Sometimes it's really a broad understanding. You live in a country or you talk to enough people and you get a sense of the economic orientation of that society, people wanting it to be a purely market economy or somewhere in between, or a state-centric economy. That is an economic orientation of a country. And then institutionalization is a fourth dimension that I look at in the book, which is how are all these arrangements codified, whether in a constitution or informally, like in the UK, they don't have a written constitution, but there are norms that are very, very strongly adhered to. It could be other kinds of institutions in a society. So using these 4 dimensions, and I go into a bit more detail in the book, it's then identifying who are the powerful people who make decisions. Is it the president, the finance minister, the central bank governor? Is it provincial authorities? Is it also a bit more informal than that? Are there special interests, etc.? And then what are their interests with respect to certain economic issues that are important in that country? In the case of Nigeria, the oil sector, economic diversification, the financial sector, things like that. And then what is the likelihood of these powerful people to support or obstruct different kinds of policies? Because again, what I do in the book is I don't necessarily go into the normative undertaking of identifying good and bad policies per se, even though there are certain kinds of policies that I think overall there's a kind of consensus globally that you need to do certain things. You do need land reform. If you don't do that, you're not going to increase productivity in agriculture. You do need civil service reform. But then the key question is, why are those policies not being implemented at a certain point in time? Who is obstructing them and why? Or why are they not amenable to policymakers at that point in time? Tax reforms, things like that. And then I guess finally, we're then able to get a better sense of whether meaningful policies can be successfully implemented or thwarted when we use this kind of thinking. So then just to quickly talk about, what this means then with respect to the analysis in the book, as I mentioned earlier, in the case of Nigeria, when certain things align, when you have a certain distribution of power that is suddenly amenable to reform, and obviously this is during a crisis period, oil revenues have declined, maybe global oil prices are at around, I don't know, $20, $30 a barrel, which was the case in the early 2000s. Suddenly, there's that impetus, that imperative, that pressure on policymakers to really generate revenue. Otherwise, you cannot even do the daily business of running a government. Even if one wants to be cynical and say the policymakers just want to appropriate or capture as much resources as possible for themselves, they cannot do that because the revenues are not there. So they have no option but to adopt a reform mindset. So when with this kind of analytical framework, we're able to get a sense of when that is the case. A crisis period, policy reforms need to happen. And then the kinds of policy reforms that decision makers opt for at that point in time. They will not do land reform or civil service reform, but they're going to do tax reforms and public financial management reforms. Then the economy grows rapidly. Maybe they might be helped by an oil boom, but that is not usually the main factor, as in the case of Nigeria. Before you get to a point where growth starts to collapse and the distribution of power changes. So I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, no, it does. And just to sort of, I guess, push this a little further, if you were to identify sort of, one major area that you think has been, consistently stalled in terms of not being amenable to reform, what would that be? And I know you've, been sort of hinting at a number of things, but if you were to pick your favorite, or in terms of the most stubbornly persistent, right? What would that be?
I'm going to mention two things. I kept hammering on about land and agricultural reform, so there's that one. One is oil industry reform more broadly, but more specifically, the regulation of the downstream sector of the petroleum industry. So downstream sector here referring to refining and refined fuels in Nigeria. If you think of the oil industry, and here I'm really, really simplifying things. So if there are oil industry experts in the audience, I'm sure they're going to wince at my oversimplification. But upstream is where you do the exploration, give licenses, and start the oil production and extraction. Midstream is transportation, basically. And I think there's some element of refining. And then downstream is more of the refining and the distribution and the sale of refined products, particularly fuels. So like gasoline, diesel, and others. That downstream element, the reform there has been very, very difficult to implement. It has been known that it needs to be a bit more liberalized. Some of the state controls have to be loosened. In particular, the use of or the provision of subsidies for refined fuels for domestic consumption is highly dysfunctional in Nigeria. The thing is, nobody even knows how much Nigeria spends on fuel subsidies, because it is budgeted in the government budget, but more of the expenditure on subsidies happens in an off-budget manner, because just the whole subsidy regime is very, very dysfunctional. So that has been extremely difficult to get rid of the subsidies, but more broadly to liberalize the downstream sector. It's something that every Nigerian government has talked about doing since the military era, since the early 1990s, but they've not been able to accomplish. And I have an entire chapter in the book devoted to that. So I give explanations as to why that is very difficult. There are structural reasons tied to the way the economy functions. Transportation and electrification rely heavily on the use of refined fuels because of the absence of mass transit and the prevailing use of passenger vehicles, but also because of the absence of grid electricity, meaning that there's a heavy reliance on diesel and gasoline generators. So there's a whole structural element there, which then means that a lot more politically connected Nigerians, not just the elite, but also the middle class, are highly dependent on those fuel subsidies, and they would object to the removal of those subsidies. So it's extremely difficult to achieve that without addressing those structural characteristics. So that would be, I would say, one key example of something that has been extremely difficult to accomplish. Civil service reform is another one that has been extremely difficult for Nigeria to accomplish. But of course, we know historically that no state has, no country has been able to get to a developmental state status without a competent bureaucracy. So those are the two I would mention.
Great, thank you. Let me ask you one more question before turning into the Q&A. And I know there's already a number of questions collecting, but if the audience members would like to add questions, please go ahead. So I want to sort of ask about climate change, and how do you see, in particular, the imperative for decarbonization, right? Sort of both within Nigeria, but also in terms of the larger international environment, and the global sort of push towards net zero. How do you see that as sort of shaping the political settlement within Nigeria? So, like, how do you make sense of that? I know it's a big question, but I just wanted to sort of get your take on how that was.
It's a very big question. I don't know if I can answer it, but let me try. I think climate change, and here by climate change, I'm referring specifically to global climate action. Global climate action here, again, referring to the transition or the aspiration to move the global economy to a low carbon future. That is, I think, bringing up old challenges or existing challenges for resource-rich countries. Of course, this goes way beyond Nigeria. It's Nigeria, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Gabon, it's every country that is rich in hydrocarbons is now confronted with the age-old challenge of economic diversification. You have to diversify your economy. It's absolutely an imperative. So in a way, it creates a new imperative to address an age-old problem, is what I would say. It also creates new opportunities and new challenges, both. I worry a bit that the prevailing discourse right now is too much focused on the risks and the problems. There are actually a lot of opportunities for oil-rich countries, oil and gas-rich countries, with respect to climate change, right? So before I get to the opportunities and all of that, let us start with the risks and the kind of the, reviving or resuscitating like a ghost of the past, countries that need to diversify their economy now. Like it's absolutely on their agenda, on their radar. It is certainly the case in Nigeria. So I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier that oil industry reforms more broadly have been extremely difficult in Nigeria, but the downstream sector, which I focused on a bit, even more so. Now, going back to the broader issue, the country struggled to pass a new petroleum industry legislation for more than 20 years until 2021, when it was finally passed. Everybody was surprised that that happened, because for a long time there was just a lot of, again, the political economy challenges that I mentioned, different interests, and it was just not in the interest of policymakers at the time to push through those reforms. So they were just not going to happen. And Nigeria's oil industry started to become less and less attractive. I don't want to say competitive, but I think it's becoming less and less competitive, right? Oil production in Nigeria for such a long time was happening onshore. There was all this conflict with host communities. The oil companies were just had a very terrible reputation for a lot of historical reasons. They started to move offshore, started to divest some of their onshore assets. Of course, there were new discoveries in other parts of Africa and, of course, other parts of the world where you don't have that much dysfunction and turmoil happening with respect to the oil industry. So that started to dawn on Nigerian policymakers that Nigeria's oil industry is becoming less attractive and less competitive. But even then, that was not a major push, because this is what I was mentioning earlier. You have to look at the domestic situation in the country. Nigeria has a very robust private sector, actually, compared to many African countries. So as international oil companies were divesting their assets, Nigerian entrepreneurs were acquiring those assets, and they were going into joint venture partnerships with like junior companies, smaller companies in Canada and the US, where the Nigerians would provide the capital. Those other companies would provide the technical know-how. So they were acquiring the assets, and still it was not a major push for policymakers to pass the new legislation until, the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and there was all this push for decarbonization, moving to a low-carbon future. And suddenly it started to dawn on Nigerian policymakers. I mean, if you do a content analysis of newspapers or debates in the parliament, people were raising this. Look, our oil sector is going to become less competitive. We need to extract as much as we can. We're going to reach peak oil. That is peak oil, I guess, peak oil demand at some point, not supply, meaning that, so then there was that imperative, that push to pass the legislation. So sorry, I went into a bit of detail there, but I wanted to highlight the point that climate change is providing a new imperative to do things that should have been done years ago, certainly with respect to oil industry reform, but certainly with respect to thinking about a post-oil future, because at some point, we're going to reach peak oil demand, and then that is going to plateau and then start to taper off. What is a country like Nigeria, what is a country like Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the UAE, what are they going to do at that point in time? I think a lot of policymakers are thinking through that. But I want to also talk about opportunities here. And there's some work where we're starting to do in this area, very, very exploratory work. I think there's a very, very big issue that policymakers, but also scholars, I think, will have to confront, that as demand for oil and gas, but oil in particular, starts to change, and it's already changing for geopolitical reasons, for economic reasons, but also the climate imperative. The development models for these countries will have to change completely. It's going to look completely different if, as an oil-producing country, you're no longer receiving the bulk of your revenues from selling this oil internationally. But oil is still going to be used for a lot of things, right? For, petrochemicals, for, at least in the case of gas, for clean cooking solutions. There's still going to be a lot of uses for oil and gas and hydrocarbons for the next 4 or 5 decades. But the economic model is going to look very, very different. What are the implications for policy making, for revenue management? I think I'm not sure many countries have started to think through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. This actually sort of blends really well with a question that we have in the chat from Kaylin Gallagher, who's the center director here. And basically his question suggests that there's a very sort of a pretty tight window, right? If there's only 25 years to diversify, based on sort of global net zero sort of assumptions. Could you talk a little bit about sort of the export sector? Like, what are the export opportunities that you see for Nigeria, especially in terms of the exchange rate implications, right? If we are going to diversify away from oil, how do you see, where do you see that coming up? Were you able to catch that, or should I?
Yeah, sorry, could you repeat that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So this is just sort of following on what you were saying about the need to diversify and how climate change is already, in a sense, reinforcing or accelerating, reforms that needed to happen. Could you talk a little bit more about the export side? What are the export possibilities, right? Especially given the need for foreign exchange and how oil has been such a big earner of foreign exchange for Nigeria. Where do you see the possibilities around exports?
Great. Sorry, my voice is a bit.
Yeah, sorry.
I recently had COVID, so you know how it is. Yeah, so I cough a bit. What are the export opportunities? There are actually a lot. In the case of Nigeria, I'm not going to mention specific sectors because there are quite a number of them. More broadly, I think this is why I mentioned that a framework like the resource curse theory does not really help us appreciate the fact that you have different types of oil producers. And their experience with developing the hydrocarbons resources has been very different. So there's a lot of variation in their experiences, in their development achievement, if I can call it that, income level, things like that. In the case of Nigeria, it actually has as I mentioned earlier, a very vibrant private sector. Nigeria has 44.5 million micro, small, and medium scale enterprises. Of course, it also has the big enterprises. You look at the list of the wealthiest people in Africa, you're going to find a couple of Nigerian tycoons who made their wealth not just in the oil sector. There are oil billionaires, but there are manufacturing tycoons, there are people in finance, etc. Beyond those big entities and enterprises, there are the 44.5 million micro, small, and medium scale enterprises that I mentioned across different industries. Even before the oil boom in the 1970s, Nigeria had a long history of commerce, trade, and entrepreneurship dating back to the pre-colonial periods. The richest man in West Africa in the early 1900s was Alhassan Tata, comes from Kano in the north, who was a merchant, a merchant into agriculture, trading, etc. Cities like Kano were very much integrated into the trans-Saharan trade system right from the 1600s, right? I'm going into all this detail to explain that there are so many things going on in the Nigerian economy, which is why the oil sector today accounts for less than 10% of GDP. As you know, Nigeria has the second largest film industry by output after Bollywood. So Bollywood is number one by output, then Nollywood, the Nigerian industry, number two, then Hollywood, number three. Of course, if you look at market capitalization, then I'm sure Hollywood is number one. So there's a lot going on. Now, the issue is with respect to exports, all of that vibrant economic activity, production, etc., and there's a huge manufacturing sector in Nigeria, is not translating into exports. Why is that? I think it's a challenge of productivity. And I discuss productivity very briefly in the book. I'm not an expert in that area. I know discussions on productivity can be extremely and highly, highly technical. But I sort of draw on existing work in the area to look at productivity in Nigeria, TFP, also labor productivity, which actually declined in the 90s during the lost decade, the 80s and the 90s in particular, and then started to go up in the 2000s when growth was happening, when reforms were happening. And then it started to decline again from around, I think, 2013, 2014. So the issue is productivity, right? But how do you increase productivity? I mean, there are supply side things that need to be done. There are demand side things that need to be done. On the supply side, you know, the country needs extensive infrastructure, transport infrastructure, connecting producers, farmers, etc., in rural areas to urban areas, connecting urban centers, connecting them to the ports. The country needs electricity, hasn't done that well in that regard. Electricity access in Nigeria is actually lower than in Ghana and in Kenya. It's less than 50% have electricity access. And of that 50%, most of them are actually using diesel-fired generators or gasoline-fired generators. It makes production expensive. You know, there are all these business surveys that have been done, access to credit, all of those things. So increasing productivity of those small and medium scale enterprises is what can help expand exports in Nigeria across the board. You would be shocked at all of the initiatives, innovations happening on a very, very small scale, but people cannot scale up. They cannot access big markets. They cannot do stuff like standards and quality control on an extensive level. Of course, there's also the demand side aspect of productivity. Increasing productivity, thinking about social protection, making sure that you have a growing and large enough market to be able to initially consume some of the things that are being produced. Nigeria hasn't done well with social protection, again, compared to even other African countries, right? So going back to the question, I went into a bit more detail there. There are actually a lot of opportunities, but basic things need to be done first. If you don't have electricity, you don't have decent broadband internet, good road networks, mass transit in particular, not just passenger vehicles, I don't think the country is going to go very, very far in diversifying its exports.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that's a great place to end this conversation at, right? There's many opportunities, but many things also need to change. Thank you all for joining this conversation. There's a link to the book in the chat. There's also a 40% discount if you would like to purchase. So I just wanted to flag that. Now, a sincere thank you to Zainab for sharing her thoughts and discussing this book with us today, and to all of you for joining this discussion. This talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we will share a link in the chat. Well, this is the final webinar for our Fall 2022 GEGI Book Talk series. We'll be publishing a lineup for the Spring 2023 series very soon. To receive updates for those events as well as other publications, you can subscribe to receive updates from GEGI, which is also in the chat that you'll see there. Thank you to all of you, and see you next time.